Hey Wargamers, welcome back. Purple Druid presents. And today we're going to talk about the Blackmoor Foundations book. I've been teasing this for a long time, but I just haven't had the time to sit down and finish what I was going to do for a script. And then, anyway, what I want to talk about is how very interesting this book is for anyone who is a historian of Dungeons & Dragons at all, or is interested in how the game was played in the early days. This is an invaluable reference. My first impression is that it does indeed look like a coffee table book, as some others have referenced. You have, for instance, these maps accompanied by a page of archivist-style notes, which are interesting in how they describe the era, the time period that these things came from. So we've got all kinds of notes and maps that develop or show the development of the Blackmoor area and how it was conceived and how it evolved over the first couple of years that the game of Blackmoor was being developed. One of the things I'm really struck by is how similar some of these maps look to wargaming maps, and specifically I want to refer to this one here and compare it to Henry Hyde's campaign diary of Martin Stott 1744. And one of the really, really interesting things is how, let's see here if I can do this side by side. We have these hex maps showing the areas where battles can take place. And of course, there are only so many ways that you can draw a map, but in my opinion, this shows the wargaming background that we're talking about here in terms of how Blackmoor was developed as a large-scale wargame campaign, faction versus faction, player versus player, pursuing their own goals and developing their own areas. So the background of the players in this game, they were very experienced wargamers. And so they would have definitely used the terminology and the methodology of their war games as this was being developed and as the idea of the individual adventurer was conceived and brought forward. So I'm really glad that this project is being undertaken, similar to the History of Wargaming project by John Curry. As Griff writes on page 2, he wants to publish as much of this as possible for everyone to see and read, rather than having these items remain hidden away, where only a secret cabal of collectors and historians can see them. Now, I'm going to say this. The Fellowship of the Thing and Dan Boggs and John Peterson and some of our other eminent gaming historians have had access to many of these important documents for a long time, a decade or more, but they've only shared bits and pieces. And one of the failings of this book is that it doesn't share some of those source documents that I think would shed even more light on the development of the game, primarily from a wargame standpoint. And this, as John Peterson has said, is the triumph of the collector over the community. He definitely values the interests of the collectors and the value of the documents that they're sitting on. That being said, Blackmoor Foundations still includes some very interesting and revelatory information. So let's take a brief look at what's inside. So on page 4, we have something that is absolutely fascinating. This is an outline of the medieval project that Dave Arneson was putting together. And it's an outline of the medieval Braunstein that he planned to hold on April 17th of 1970. And what's fascinating is the kind of game that is described is definitely a war game. The factions and the domains are established in advance, and at least some of them are already assigned to players. If you look at point 2 here, we have Jenkins Land is assigned to Sir Jenkins. Williamsport is assigned to the player Bill Hoyt. Swampwood is assigned to the character Marshall Keyston, who's played by Ed Wernke. We also have a description of the Southland where the Araks live. Those are cunning bandits. To the north, we have the Scandinavians, who are described as savage sea raiders. To the northwest, we have the Red Wizards' Coven. And to the west and southwest are the Picts, described as uncivilized barbarians. And I suppose these last 4 areas are the open factions or unassigned factions that are set up to be played by whoever else might show up at the game. The notice was sent out in a newsletter, and so obviously Dave would have no idea how many people would show up or who they might all be. Point 3 is interesting in that it describes the forces available to each landowner and additional troops for each baron. And if you look at page 27 in Chainmail, you can see that these forces come up to about 205 points. They're highlighted here, but I've listed them here for you. Let's see here. So there's 12 bowmen, who I believe would count as levy troops, 16 militia pikemen likewise, 10 unarmored swordsmen that I believe would be light foot, 2 knights, 2 squires, 8 mounted men-at-arms, 6 archers, 4 armored pikemen, 4 axemen, 20 swordsmen, and 3 remounts. And then each baron gets their own personal guard of 6 armored pikemen and 10 dismounted men-at-arms, which I believe would count as armored foot and heavy foot respectively. So that comes up to about 205 points in chainmail for the landowners, and then 246 for the barons. So again, this is absolutely fascinating, and I believe this is the precursor to what we see in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook for when the Lord, the fighter, or the magic user, or the cleric develops their own domain, and they attract a force of men-at-arms. So I think this is where that comes from, which, again, absolutely fascinating. Point number 4 here says that the enemy forces will vary in size and composition depending on a random levy of troops. So I imagine this means that for your groups like the Araks and the Scandinavians and the Picts, that their troop forces will be randomized. Now, unfortunately, we have only this one page without any further notes on force composition in any of the ensuing battles. So I have a feeling this may be all there is. Excuse me, but again, it would be really interesting to see what some of these enemy forces compositions might have been. Now, here, further up, we have on page 42, the newly discovered Ken Fletcher collection, which consists of a set of session reports written in a narrative style. And again, these are fascinating. It's an amazing look at how the game is being played and how it's described. Unfortunately, once again, we have an example of something missing. These historical descriptions of play are important as an artifact of the style of play. But what's equally important are the notes regarding the mechanics. And here, Griff writes that in our archives, we have many documented but not dated events that throw a wrench into the idea of a linear development. One such set of papers is the medieval battle notes, Bill Hoyt says the battle notes come from early 1970. All right, well, that's fascinating, but where are the battle notes? I'd love to see them. I did talk to Griff about this, and he said that another historian has them and hasn't published them, again, which is very unfortunate. Those medieval battle notes, really, they need to be in this book, especially when we get to this first example of a battle being held within the keep of Blackmoor. And while we can look at the First Fantasy campaign for more information about troops and military forces, again, we're missing out on the context and, how was this battle managed? Did they use Strategos rules? Did they use chainmail? Did they have another set of rules that they were using? That, to me, as a wargame historian, is equally as important as the narrative discussion of how the battle played out. So I have done a lot of other research on this, and as mentioned before, I'm going through Strategos. I've gone through the rules from Tony Bath and Morshauser and Featherstone, etc., trying to figure out how these games may have actually been played. Dan Boggs, in a blog post from July of 2017, writes that Arneson has stated the earliest games used Chainmail's fantasy combat table. Again, which, if that's true, that would be fantastic, because I'd love to see maybe how this battle, that we have literally everything else. We have a list of the forces. We have a map of the deployment. We're ready to play a war game. We just, what rules were used here? Again, to me, that's a serious omission, and it's really unfortunate. Now, that being said, there's a strong possibility that the group, because they were playing with Strategos A and the various summary versions of Strategos, it's very possible that Dave modified Strategos for an individual scale combat. And the reason I say that is based on my own reading of Strategos so far, and then on notes and discussion with Rodney Hampton of Dragons Beyond, who has actually played out the basic game here. And it does appear that you could certainly use this in a smaller skirmish style game, which is what we have there. And it's just a small step from the force listing that we see in that battle report, that session report, to scaling that up and use the actual Strategos rules, or rather having the Strategos rules and deciding to scale them down to an individual level. Now, I will have a lot more to say about Strategos very soon. With any luck, I'll be able to bring Rodney on the show to talk about it. But in any case, I'm very excited about this book. I'm excited to read and reread the after action reports that are in here. This Fletcher collection, I mean, there's page after page after page of narrative description of how these battles were fought. And again, absolutely invaluable to a historian of the game and anyone who's interested in learning how to play the game the way it was played in the earliest days. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and drop them down in the comment area below. I do appreciate all of the comments and support that we're getting, and I look forward to further discussions about this. Also, for more information, be sure to check out wargameculture.substack.com, and there you can follow along as I go through the Strategos rules and in my own poor way, try to reverse engineer what the group came up with in order to get their Strategos N and Strategos A. Y'all have a great day and keep on gaming.